in case you're following along on your program, this is the room and the session for topic B, which is voting systems innovation. How do we create more user-friendly, accessible, and secure systems for casting and counting ballots? Simple little question, and hopefully we can answer that here from the panel or from those of you who are in the room. Also, if you're following the program, I am not Efrain Escobedo. Efrain is my colleague, and unfortunately he is under the weather, so I'm pitch hitting for him today. So we're going to start the panel today with Eugene Lee from the Asian Pacific American Legal Center, who is going to talk about, do I have that order right? I'm sorry. We're going to start with Susan Lapsley, who is the Deputy Secretary of State for HAVA and voting systems. And Susan's going to provide us with an overview of the status of the voting systems certification and approval process in California, and maybe touch a little bit on the national process as well. Then we'll move to Eugene Lee from the Asian Pacific American Legal Center, who's going to talk about the impacts of voting systems and voting technology on minority communities and how that needs to be factored into the discussion about modernizing voting systems. Then I will come back and give a brief and broad overview of the voting systems assessment project that Los Angeles County has undertaken, and talk a little bit about the status of that. And then what we really want to do is open up a dialogue with all of you. So we will leave plenty of time at the conclusion of the session for your questions and comments, although we will ask that our preference is that we get more questions than comments, and if you have comments, if you could keep them concise so that we give everybody a chance to participate in the dialogue, that would be appreciated. So I'm going to kick it over to Susan to start us off.
Well, first, I'd like to say thank you for having us. I have chosen to sit over here. I think I'm coming down with a cold. I have 2 sick kids, and I do not want to infect anyone up here, and I won't spread my germs outward, but this was by choice. They didn't relegate me to the side of the table. Everyone here has a fairly good knowledge of the testing process, both at EAC and at the state. I don't know how many of you know about a monthly CCROV, which is our advice to the counties that goes out. It is a summary of what's going on in the voting system testing world. It's done monthly. It's on our website under our CCROVs. The last one we did was January 10th. We usually get them out the first Thursday or Friday of every month. Kind of depends on holidays, but please take a look at them. It gives a very good summary of where federal testing is, where state testing is, and state testing includes both our state certification process, but also our admin approval process. And again, those are on our website. And if you would like a copy of our most recent one, you can email or call Ryan Macias in our office, and he'd gladly provide you with a copy of them. The EAC, as everyone knows, and I'm sure it's been a part of the discussion today, is it's a ship that doesn't have a whole lot of leaders right now at this point. What does that mean for testing? Testing has still kind of trucked along. It's the independent laboratories that are doing a lot of the testing, so it hasn't created a real drag. So there is testing that's being done. California specific, there are 2 systems that are at the tail end of the federal process, and that's Dominion's WinEDS 4.0 system, and was it Dominion 4.0? Democracy Suite, thanks, Ryan. And then ES&S's Unity 4.0. So there's 2 systems that we actually have a application that's pending before us, but we need an EAC number before we can start moving ahead with our process. We have the application, we have their deposit, and we're all geared, ready to go, just waiting for that EAC number. As everyone knows, there's a need for new voting equipment out there. A lot of the electronic voting equipment that the counties have is 10 years old, and we're at a point where we do need new systems, and there are these 2 that are coming down the pipeline. So that's really where we're at as far as state testing and the EAC process.
Eugene, you want to pick up for that? Good afternoon, everyone. Just wanted to start off by thanking the James Irvine Foundation for supporting Future of California elections and being a true leader in the field of election reform, and also thank you to California Common Cause for hosting this wonderful conference. I also wanted to acknowledge a few other folks that that have been active in the issues of voting systems. So Kim Alexander at the California Voter Foundation, Pam Smith at Verified Voting Foundation, and Hillary Sklar at Disability Rights California, along with myself and Registrar Logan and Efrain and Escobedo at the LA County Registrar's Office, have been, we've had periodic conference calls about voting systems issues and strategizing about what needs to be done to allow for innovation of voting systems that better serve the needs of California voters while also ensuring security for voting systems. I just wanted to acknowledge our colleagues and to mention again some of the work that they've done. So Kim Alexander mentioned earlier this morning, she mentioned the policy brief that California Voter Foundation has released looking at California's voting systems, both with a look back at the history of various voting systems in California, as well as looking at the road ahead for what might need to be done to pave the way for innovation. Pam Smith's group, Verified Voting Foundation, last year put together a report looking at the 50 states' practices on voting systems regulation, and that is an important resource as we consider what to do moving forward. I wanted to start by talking about an incident or an experience I had. My organization, Asian Pacific American Legal Center, does a lot of poll monitoring on election day, where we send volunteers into polling places to do a couple of things. One is to gauge whether language assistance is being provided well or not well, and to work with county registrars to address any shortcomings that we see on election day. For example, missing bilingual poll workers, or translated materials not having been sent to the polling place, or not being displayed well. It's a great partnership with election officials, and it's something that we do during major elections. I recall during the November 2005 special election, folks probably remember that had 8 ballot measures on the ballot. I was out in the field myself. I was a poll monitor at a polling place in Los Angeles, Chinatown, which has a large concentration of Chinese American voters, many of whom have limited English ability. So I remember being at that polling place as a poll monitor and observing what was going on. I saw an elderly Chinese American voter come in. She came in a wheelchair with her caretaker, and she indicated through her caretaker that she wanted a Chinese language sample ballot. So for those who are not familiar with LA County's voting system that is currently in use, the main device is a blank Scantron type ballot that gets inserted into something called a vote recorder, and the vote recorder pages list the various races and ballot measures that are on the ballot. And for a limited English-speaking voter to be able to make sense of that, they have to refer to a translated version of those vote recorder pages, which are contained in a translated sample ballot. So this voter came in and indicated that she wanted a Chinese language sample ballot, and the poll workers there indicated that there were none. This was a little bit later on during the day, and I gather what had happened is that the poll site had run out of actually Chinese language sample ballots. So I saw the voter talk to her caretaker and said, "I don't want to vote," and the voter left the polling place. So I actually followed the voter outside the polling place and tried to alert them to other resources that they might be able to use. For example, the caretaker going into the voting booth with the voter and helping the voter understand the ballot, and that's something that voters are allowed to do under the Federal Voting Rights Act. But the voter indicated that she didn't want to do that. She wanted to vote independently using this translated sample ballot to be able to understand the ballot and cast her vote. And so for me, that remains a powerful example of how language assistance is very powerful, very important for voters, and how when it's lacking, voters sometimes are denied the right to vote. And you know, these sorts of things happen across the state. We've seen instances in other counties where translated materials were not provided and voters were unable to vote. And this is not to disparage election officials by any means. The registrars that APOC has worked with, and I know that community groups we work with, also work with other county registrars, and we found that registrars are very committed to providing the highest level of support for voters. But despite the best poll worker training and despite the best preparation efforts, things don't always go perfectly on election day, and you do see gaps in language assistance. And you know, I think poll workers have a lot to take care of on election day. They're very busy, particularly during high turnout elections. They have lots of things that they need to worry about, such as making sure that voters sign the roster, taking care of provisional voters, making sure that the voting systems, the voting machines are working properly. And you know, it's more complex in counties with diverse language requirements under the Voting Rights Act. Sometimes there's issues of poll worker tables not having enough space to display translated materials. And so, you know, it's not to disparage election officials, but just a frank acknowledgement that language assistance isn't always adequately provided at polling places despite best efforts. So, you know, the tie-in that I see to voting systems is that there's certain types of voting systems that make it easier for voters to be less reliant on other human beings to be able to access language assistance. So in the case of LA County and several other jurisdictions where voters are reliant on translated paper ballots or translated sample ballots, it depends on whether those materials are adequately displayed. Voters don't always know that there's this language assistance available, so it's dependent on whether poll workers have displayed these materials to ensure that voters can access them. It's dependent on whether poll workers are proactively reaching out to voters and determining whether they need language assistance and offering voters translated materials. So there's that human element that is inherent in certain types of voting systems. And so the thought that's occurred to me is, what if we can come up with voting systems that empower voters to make that choice themselves, to know that language, to put that language assistance front and center before voters and allow them to make that choice. And you know, there are some voting systems currently in use that do that. There's, for example, a device called the Heart eSlate, a machine that's used in Orange County and San Mateo County. And after a voter receives his or her access code, they go to the voting machine, and the first thing that they do is indicate what language that they would like to conduct the voting process in and fill out their ballot in. So with that kind of system, it's not dependent on poll workers displaying the materials or knowing to offer those materials to voters. Rather, the voter's empowered to make that language selection him or herself. So, you know, it's a very basic concept, but it's one that, you know, I'm hopeful that we can try to explore as we talk about innovating voting systems and getting that in place more broadly so that limited English-speaking voters can make that language selection on their own. And, you know, this is important on a fairly large scale. If you look at the Asian American electorate demographic data, census figures show fairly high limited English proficiency rates for the Asian American population overall. generally ranging from a third to 40% of the population, and going as high as above 50% for certain ethnic groups. And those figures tend to be mirrored in the electorate itself for Asian Americans, so not just talking about the general population, but those who are actually registered to vote and actually voting. If you look at exit poll data, which is measuring actual voters, you'll see that limited English proficiency rates tends to mirror those within the general population. So generally a third to 40% of voters, and higher for certain ethnic groups. So this is fairly important for the Asian American electorate. And you know, it goes back to this notion of what should a voting system do, right? There's various considerations for the various stakeholders in the election system. For election administrators, they have to make sure that the poll worker training covers how to set up a voting system. If the election administrators have to deploy these systems to polling places on election day, they have to figure out how to troubleshoot them when these machines might break down. But for voters, voting systems is, you know, at heart, it's about making sure that voters can cast ballots as they intend. And central to that is the ability of a voter to understand what's on the ballot. And in California, that makes language access very important. So, you know, APOC is hoping to be able to work with various stakeholders on innovating new voting systems. We see a critical opportunity here, and a real strong momentum through future of California elections. One last thing I want to mention is that aside from this issue of language accessibility, there's other aspects of accessibility, including for voters with disabilities. And then there's this notion of voting systems being tied to other election reforms. So, you know, if you think about early voting, the way that's done practically is that it's predicated on having voting systems that can call up one of, let's say in LA County, one of over 600 types of ballots. And if the voting system can't do that, then it's not feasible to have early voting sites throughout the jurisdiction. So if you look at LA County in 2004, there were as many as 17 early voting sites across the county. And I think the number was about the same for the 2006 election cycle. And that was through the use of a certain type of voting system. And because there were some conditions imposed on the use of those types of voting systems, LA County, like many counties, have cut back on early voting. And so if we want to see basically a reinstatement of widespread early voting, I think we need to look at voting systems that can call up multiple ballot types rather than polling places having to be stocked with you know, every single ballot type that the jurisdiction has. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Eugene, for that, and thank you, Susan, for the overview. I think what I'd like to do is start by kind of painting the picture of where things stand on a statewide basis, and then transition into what that has meant for LA County and what we've embarked on as a result of that picture. So there are really three overriding components that make up the current status of voting systems in the state of California, and in many respects these are not unique to the state of California. It's really a nationwide issue. And the first of that would be the age of the equipment that's in place in our counties and that we're using for voting purposes, and the fact that we have a very limited market for the replacement of that equipment. Second would be the regulatory environment, which I think is, putting it generously, has been unstable and erratic. Over the course of the last 10 years, the process for testing, certifying, and acquiring voting systems has changed dramatically, and there really has been no stability in that area. And as Susan indicated, certainly with the national Elections Assistance Commission, no stability in the near future with that regard. And third is an issue of funding, that even if there were systems available for replacing the current systems, and even if there was clear regulatory pathway for acquiring and implementing those systems, by and large, most jurisdictions in the state of California do not have a funding source to replace their current voting system. So with that sad picture, let me put it into some historical perspective. I think historically in this country, the development and availability of voting systems has been primarily reactive and insulated. It's been reactive to the deficiencies, perceived and real, of the system that was used in the last election or in the previous election cycle. It's been insulated in the sense that the limited market that develops and produces voting systems primarily develops and produces those in response to the regulatory reaction that I just described. So what we saw in 2000 was the big concern about punch card voting systems. So there was a rush to replace punch card voting systems because they were widely viewed as a primary source of the issues that happened in the 2000 election. And there was this funding that came that we'd never seen before from the federal government to help fund the replacement of punch card voting systems. In California, we had Prop 41 pass to provide yet another source of funding to replace those systems. So there was a big move to replace those systems, to replace them quickly, and to replace them with, at that time, what was the newest product on the market, which was direct recording electronic voting equipment. And I think what we know now is that the direct recording electronic voting equipment that was developed and put on the market was perhaps not ready for prime time. It had a lot of features that were appealing, especially features that addressed the deficiencies in the punch card voting system, but security concerns, and there were concerns about the lack of a verifiable paper ballot and audit trail. So then we saw the reactive process happen once again, and we reacted through legislation that imposed the voter verified paper audit trail component of those voting systems, but it was not part of the original development. So instead it was retrofitted, added on, and was not done with any true focus on the usability and the true intent of what that was about. And those are the systems that have been in use for the last several election cycles in California. Many jurisdictions have actually moved back to systems that they used prior to those systems because of the unstable regulatory environment. And the development of new systems has really ground to halt because it's been unclear to what standards you would build a new voting system. And if you were doing that from the standpoint of a commercial market where you were trying to build and sell a product that you could make money on and make a profit on, you really don't have the guidelines, the adopted guidelines to guide you in that process. So all of that to paint the picture that what we identified in 2009 in Los Angeles County is that our voting system, which really the technology was by and large developed in the 1960s, is at the end of its productive life cycle. It's not a system that can sustain for too many more election cycles. In fact, there were concerns when the top two primary was adopted whether or not it would have the capacity to operate that primary under the regulatory environment that was established for the top two primary. We actually had to go in and get special legislation to address that. The other reality that we had, both in recognizing that our voting system needed to be replaced, but is what I mentioned this morning, and that was the recognition that there really is nothing on the market today that is certified and available for purchase in California or in the nation that would meet the needs of Los Angeles County, given our demographics, our language requirements, all of the things that we've been discussing throughout the day. So we initiated a voting systems assessment project in 2009 where we made a conscious choice to say that given all of those factors, given that we didn't know where the funding would come from, we didn't know what the regulatory environment was, and the fact that we knew we had to replace our voting system, that we were going to start from scratch. We were going to go back and have conversations with the voters and the stakeholders in Los Angeles County to really assess what are our needs for for a voting system in the largest jurisdiction in the country. And that we spent a lot of time, the better part of 2 years, collecting data. We had a partnership with the Cal State MIT Voting Technology Project through some generous funding from the Irvine Foundation to do some field research. We did voter surveys, we did focus groups, we held a public symposium, simply to ask the questions of what do our voters like about their current voting experience, what do they expect of their future voting experience, what would they like to be different, all of those kind of feel-good questions, but they get to the heart of how the system and the usability of that system impacts the likelihood of a voter to participate in the election and have confidence that their vote is counted and cast as they intended it to be. We then moved into a crowdsourcing design phase where we put out this very broad question through a kind of an innovative crowdsourcing mechanism to say, if you were to design a voting system that could meet the common elements of this data that we collected, what would it look like? What would it do and how would it function? And we got a lot of really interesting feedback from that spanned from, the suggestion that we create robots to the suggestion that we go back to hand counting paper ballots at individual polling places throughout the county. So it really ran the gamut. So now we're at a stage in that process where we are moving from the abstract, the brainstorming process to something more concrete. We are in the process of an engagement that will take all of that data, all of those brainstorming concepts, and we'll develop those into 3 to 5 models, design models, for what a voting system could look like in LA County. And we're requiring in this engagement that it's not just a pretty picture of something that this is what it would look like and if it would work, but it has to be backed up with a feasibility study that shows that there is the technology, the expertise, and the ability to develop that model in a way that would meet the public expectations for security, transparency, usability, and functionality, and that it could be practically implemented in a jurisdiction the size of LA County. So that's where we're at today. We expect to have those design models probably late this summer, at which point we'll go through another series of public vetting, focus groups, field testing, and refine those into concepts that we can then invest in some prototyping and engineering, and ultimately we will make a decision publicly on where we're going to go. Now, parallel to that, obviously, given my introductory remarks, we can't do that in a vacuum. We need to, while we're doing that design work and that feasibility, we also need to be addressing some stabilization in the regulatory environment around voting system certification and approval in California, and we need to address the funding issues. So you will see legislation offered in the current legislative session that will address some of the certification and approval processes in California with some conditions that would bifurcate us from the federal voluntary voting system standards that currently bind the process in California. You'll also see legislation that will open up the possibility of using the existing Prop 41 funds that are still allocated but haven't been spent to be able to use those funds for the development and implementation of a new model of voting system, whereas today those funds exist, but they are restricted to the purchase of a commercially certified system that is required to go through federal and state certification. So we're in a unique situation. Many of the counties don't have that funding source still available. LA County still has dedicated funds from Prop 41 because we did not fully replace our voting system during that time period, but we can't access that funding in support of our project. So we're going to try and address that through legislation as well. So we're trying to do this in a way that is transparent and open, in a way that is that can be duplicated by other jurisdictions, and also that focuses on some key elements that have been part of the dialogue about voting systems on the state and national level, but they haven't been part of the regulatory process or the business model of voting systems. And those are things like looking at, is there a distinction between a publicly owned voting system and a commercially owned voting system? Is there a difference in how we approve and how we acquire voting systems if they are using non-proprietary software and hardware versus proprietary equipment? The implementation and value of risk-limiting auditing functions as a further means of verifying the integrity and the accuracy of a voting system beyond the original testing and certification process. And also looking at the reality that most systems of this magnitude that operate in the public and private sector today are not one-size-fits-all systems where you invest all in one single system. Rather, we're in an age of system integration where you take pieces of various systems that can function together to meet a set of principles and values. And we've established those principles and values through a public advisory committee made up of stakeholders. Eugene sits on that. There are a number of people in the room that sit on our advisory committee. So it's a daunting project. It's something that needs to happen. We're committed to doing it in a way that hopefully it can be duplicated by others. Travis County, Texas is another jurisdiction in the nation that is doing a similar process, and we're collaborating with them. And it's an iterative process, so we don't really know what the full end game is because we have these parallel processes going on at the same time. We need to be sure that we're well positioned, but we also recognize that we cannot sit around and wait for the stabilization of the Elections Assistance Commission and the adoption of federal voting system standards. And we can't wait for a commercial market that currently is unable to meet the demands of our county. So that's the process we're undertaking in LA County. It is a open process. We invite anyone and everyone to participate and give feedback on it. If you go to our website at lavote.net, you can identify there's a portion of the website under our elections and voting page that has all of the data that I talked about. It has quarterly reports that we make to our Board of Supervisors. It has the adopted principles that our advisory committee has come up with. It has the brainstorming design concepts that I spoke of. All of that now is going to begin to be honed into something that will take shape and hopefully will lead us to a voting system that has the ability to adapt to changes in voter behavior, changes in voter expectations, and changes in external factors that affect elections. So we rely heavily on vote by mail in this state, yet we also know that there's some question about the stability of the U.S. Postal Service, and we need to be sure that whatever voting system we move to has the ability to adapt to those changes in the postal system. We also know that we have new generations of voters who will be using this voting system, and if we're going to invest large amounts of public funding in a voting system to replace a system that has lasted over 40 years, we want to have a system that has the ability and the flexibility to adapt to those changes in regulatory environment and behavior as well. So again, we invite, if I haven't said it enough, we need all the help we can get to make this happen. So we invite your participation and your support, your questions. Ask the hard questions. Help us make sure that we do this in a way that meets the needs of our voters. And with that, I want to give Susan and Eugene a chance for any follow-up comments, and then we'll open it up to all of you for questions.
So having paid attention to what LA is doing, it's very exciting. It's an interesting model. And we're looking forward to seeing what comes out of there and working together to see what we can do to improve the face of voting systems that are currently available. I think from the Secretary's perspective, Dean had rhetorically asked the question about the regulatory environment and testing and working with the state. From the Secretary's perspective, obviously, having standard testing and independent testing, regardless if it's a county that owns it or a city that owns it or developed it, always having a standard that's done independently is crucial. I think in a perfect world, what we would all hope for is to be able, or would like, is to have a voting system where you could go over to, I'm going to simplify far too much, but go out to Walmart, pick up the pieces, come back, put it together, and be able to implement it. So you don't have to worry about a vendor that's bringing it to market. You don't have to be at their beck and call. And there's 58 counties, 58 different needs. Not one package fits fits all the counties. So being able to have options and not being at the mercy of the vendor, I think, is what we'd all wish for. So it's very interested in seeing what comes out of this project. Open and disclosed source is something that obviously that the Secretary has been very interested in, and how that plays into what LA does. We're interested in seeing what ends up coming out of that. And accessibility has always been a very important aspect of voting systems, hitting on what Eugene had also spoke about. When I left the office, I was a couple minutes late getting over here because we were on the line with our quarterly Voting Accessibility Advisory Committee, our VAC meeting. Many of the counties have their own VACs. We have our own VAC, and we meet to discuss on the variety of issues that voters with specific needs have, and it's been very helpful from the Secretary's perspective. So everything that you guys have said, we agree with, and are very interested to see how it plays out.
I don't have anything further to add. I just wanted to get part of our hope here with this particular session is to collect feedback from various folks on voting systems, including voter feedback, thoughts from election administrators on how voting systems relate to their poll worker training, and things like deployment of voting systems on election day, equipment troubleshooting. And what are some things that need to be kept in mind, or should be kept in mind, as we think about ways to create a more favorable market that will support different models of developing voting machines other than simply commercial development, and what kind of policy changes we might consider in how voting systems are tested and improved.
So I think following the format that we had this morning, if you have a question, if you stand up, I guess I should stand up so I can see you. And I'll acknowledge you, and then if you could just let us know who you are, and if you could direct your question to whoever you want to speak on the panel, we'd appreciate it. So start with this gentleman here.
My name is Efrain. I'm from Santa Clara County on the Citizen Advisory Commission on Elections. My question is mostly for Steve Logan, but also for the others. When you talked about the reality of system integration and mix and match, and talking about changing the process of testing, one thing that's been sort of a bugaboo with me for a long time is maybe something that changed, or that I was misinformed about, but that basically voting systems are approved as systems and not as separate components. Is any of that going towards trying to be able to approve separate components with well-defined standards between them that then allow for innovations in one part without having to develop everything else to go with it? And is that part of what you were talking about, or the others, what you think that whether it was or wasn't part of what you were referring to?
Sure, I'll try to address that, and then I'll also let Susan add anything if she wants to correct anything I say or mention. I think largely you're correct that voting systems have been certified as an entire system, and that system is locked down by that certification or approval. So any modification within that, sometimes as, well, I shouldn't say simple, but sometimes even just a component, a battery, or a piece of equipment that's embedded in that system where there's something new and available that may be a better product, often triggers the requirement that that system has to go back through entire certification, either at the federal and state level, or I know in some cases the state has done modifications to the approval based on that as well. So I think there's some criteria around that, but certainly the new model that I'm talking about contemplates separate certification of varying pieces, but then also the testing and certification of them integrated together. So that is the flexibility that I think we're looking for in LA County, and that I think is something that is a fundamental change in the process. I do think in our law in the state of California there are some specifications. For instance, ballot marking devices are called out as a separate component, and they have a separate approval process outside of the entire voting system. But as far as the The ballot creation and the tabulation process, our current regulatory environment contemplates that in a single contained system that is subject to one certification and approval process. Susan? Ryan?
Yeah, and I don't want to get too far in the weeds here, but it depends on, you talked about ballot creation, it depends on where that is resident at. For some systems, it's outside of the voting system. Some it's within. If it's within and there's a change, that needs to be modified. We do have an admin approval process at the state, so if there is a modification to the system, we have, and again, if you take a look at our monthly update, you'll see what kind of modifications we've done on a regular basis. At any given time, we have anywhere between 3 and 10 modifications that are before us. So, but as a whole, a voting system has to work end to end, and there has to be a guarantee on the security and the functionality that it's going to function as it's intended. And if parts are being taken out and put in without any sort of testing end to end, there's a concern with the accuracy of it. So yes, as a whole, both on the federal and the state level, it's treated as one unit. But we can, through the admin approval process, you can make changes and modifications to it.
If I could just add one more thought to that, which is, I think your question gets at what I think some folks call this concept of modular testing, and I think Susan's point is very well taken. That at some point the system needs to be tested as a whole. But if there was a way to allow for testing of various components along the way, that could foster a more innovative market where a particular stakeholder, let's say a university or a nonprofit group or a commercial vendor, doesn't have the resources or necessarily the desire to create an entire voting system, but has a really great idea for a particular component. For example, the interface between the interface that a voter uses to make his or her choices. And if a modular testing approach was adopted, that seems to me that could open up the door for a better market that allows various stakeholders to develop really great ideas into actual components that could be integrated into a voting system. Again, Susan's point is well taken that at some point you do have to test the system as a whole, but what if we added in this modular testing approach? I think the analogy to popular consumer culture could be to various components that talk to each other through common data exchange standards. For example, a lot of folks have devices that use Bluetooth, where you can connect your phone to your car and make a call through your car stereo system, or connect your computer to a printer through Bluetooth and print something wirelessly. So that kind of modular testing regime does presuppose the development of uniform standards for how these different components would talk to each other. I just wanted to get that concept out there for folks to start grappling with in their minds as something that can be very, very relevant in the voting system context.
Thank you. Kim?
My personal opinion, yes, I think it should be tested. I think that there's a concern on the standards, and it's 58 counties, 58 ways. The counties do a very good job communicating with them between themselves, but there are, when it's software that is the deciding factor, I think that there needs to be an independent review of it. That's my personal opinion. Dean, I don't know if you guys use the software.
We do use signature verification software. I would make a couple of comments on that. I agree with the concept of uniform standards, and I think there should be uniform application of that. I also highly value transparency, and so I think that one of the reasons that has not been an issue around the state, and certainly in LA County, is because we can demonstrate the viability and the validity of that process. Candidly, where I would come down on that is before we start adding additional things to be certified and approved, I think we need to fix the certification and approval process that is broken for the components that are already covered by that. So I would not be opposed to that dialogue, and I certainly believe that we have a responsibility as local administrators to be accountable and transparent about the systems we're using, and I think there are ways for us to demonstrate that. But again, I think the crises we have in this state is the instability of the current certification and testing and approval process for voting systems as they're already defined, and I think we need to get that fixed first. Yeah. Well, I would just say that the concept of the use of tools like post-election auditing and risk-limiting auditing concepts is very much a part of the dialogue we're having in LA County, and for the very reason that Pam stated, is that provides another transparent and at least somewhat independent way of verifying the accuracy and the integrity of the outcome of the systems. And again, I think that could be applied broadly within the current definition of voting systems, as well as to the broader systems that Kim brought up as well.
I just add to the seminars. There's the NIST that's in February, and then there's also a certification symposium in June that might be the creme de la creme of the geeks. So
The Uber geek.
The Uber geek. Yeah.
And the producers in the back of the room are telling me that we have to cut this off so that we can go to the next session. I know I'm going to be around this afternoon, and I believe Eugene and Susan, are you going to be here for
For a little bit, if you want to
a
take the
while?
risk of talking to me.
And I think we're all open to continuing the dialogue. So thank you very much.